Hello everybody, and welcome to this video, which is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. So today I'm going to show you how to do some post-editing to your pages. So we're going to go to the Naval Photos page, and as you can see, this is where you link to all the various archives of photos I've put up so far. But some people have pointed out that, well, this white text is easy to see when it's over the hull of the carrier, but hard to see in the lighter areas. Now, I could just change it all to black, which is what a lot of the rest of the site is in. But as you can very quickly see, this just inverts the problem. Now the text on the lighter part of the photo is easy to see, and the text over the hull is quite hard to see. So let's just Control Z undo that. And instead we're going to go into Edit Section. And well, this is the whole section that we've inserted, but as you can see, we've got various alignment bits and pieces, the overall color scheme, but we're going to go instead to the background. And go down to the bottom, you can see image opacity is set to 15%. If I rack it all the way up, it goes very dark grey, you can barely see anything. But if I play around, maybe set it to just 50%, you can see we've maintained the picture in the background, but now that white text, because it's gone a little bit grey, is much more visible, much easier to access. And who knows, I might come back and revisit how these links are laid out completely at some point in the future. But for the minute, accessibility much improved. So if after all these little mini tutorials I've been doing, you think you could build a website for maybe ideally naval history purposes, but you never know, you might want to do it for some other reason, then head over to squarespace.com/Drakenfell. You can get a free trial, and once you're ready, that little link will give you 10% off your first website or domain. So thanks once again to Squarespace for sponsoring the video, and on with the main show. So something that comes up semi-regularly when we're looking at the various wars between England and then later Britain, the United Kingdom, and France that permeated much of the last millennia or so is why exactly does France have so much trouble invading England? Because it seems that England doesn't have all that much trouble invading France. Look at the 100 Years' War, for example. English armies show up in France all the time, despite the fact that England is by far the smaller, the least populous, and until the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, by far the less wealthy of the two adversaries. So surely if England can consistently invade France, France should be able to consistently invade England, and with the ability to, for most of the period between the year 1000 and the year 2000, build a larger fleet, have a larger, perhaps more well-equipped and more experienced army, France should long ago have conquered England. And yes, of course, there was the Norman invasion of 1066, and then subsequently various incursions onto English soil, and more than a few attempted invasions, various attempted invasions during the Jacobite uprisings, for instance, or a little bit earlier, the Battle of the Solent, where the Mary Rose sank, but they never seemed to quite work. Well, as it turns out, the answer is quite complex, and it's all to do with the English Channel and how that affects how you can deploy a navy, because of course you need a navy to be able to transport men across from one country to the other. And this breaks down into a number of naturally occurring problems that stymie France's ability to exert its, historically speaking, greater strength against England. And those are the currents, geography, geology, the wind, and Cherbourg. And we're going to look at them in that order because currents, geography, and geology actually all interlink with each other. So let's consider the English Channel. Obviously, the exact coastline has changed a little bit over the past 1,000 years or so, with various effects on various ports. But we're looking more generally at the entire thing. Now, of course, in France, the channel is called La Manche, but we're speaking English, so we're going to call it the channel. So, the first problem is the currents. The prevailing current in the main body of the English Channel is from, very crudely speaking, southwest to northeast. So, it flows from the Atlantic entrance of the channel up towards the Dover Straits. It's perhaps more accurately described as west-southwest to east-northeast, but you get the general drift. Now, there are some slightly different currents in the western approaches and at the Dover Straits, especially dependent on what tidal stage everything's at. But generally speaking, water is flowing from the Atlantic towards the North Sea. And this slight difference in the direction of the currents versus the actual shape and direction of the channel, and the therefore relative alignment of the two coastlines, is the fundamental cause of all of France's problems. Because the natural slight misalignment of the currents means that the current wants to hit the southern coast of the UK a little bit harder than it does the northern coast of France. But then you also have geography and geology playing its role, and that actually also links in somewhat to Cherbourg, in that the Brittany Peninsula, which is the northwestern corner of France sticking out into the Atlantic, further blocks and slows down some of those prevailing currents coming in off the Atlantic. And this means that, generally speaking, you're going to get somewhat more erosion on the UK or English coast, and somewhat more deposition, generally speaking, on the French coast. Now, again, in very local areas, this can be slightly different, but a lot of the local differences are often due to things like river deposits flowing out into the channel rather than the broad effect of the channel itself. So what has this got to do with navies? Well, it more specifically has to do with ports, because ports are the things that support navies. So it means that, broadly speaking, the northern French coast, at least the French Channel coast, has over time been able to build up a lot more alluvial deposits, that is, deposits of silt, soil and fine sand coming out of all the various rivers on the northern coast of France, and any seaborne deposits that are being washed up the channel by the various channel currents, because obviously they're entering a slower area of those currents, they begin to drop out the heavier material, and so deposition off the coast increases further still. Combine that then with a sea that now contains relatively fine material, because most of the coarse material has dropped out, coming up against the French coast at a relatively slow speed, and erosion is also significantly reduced, and thus the French coastline has a very gentle slope out into the sea or the channel, for quite a considerable distance, as you can see on these charts. Whereas on the English side of the channel, you get faster flowing sea currents much closer to the shore, and therefore they both erode the shoreline back considerably faster, and they wash away a good deal of alluvial deposits, while not leaving much trace of deposit material themselves, relatively speaking, to the French coast. Now, from a purely geological perspective, the various layers of rock and sediment that make up this part of the world, the UK and France, at least in the Channel area, are actually not all that different, especially as you get further east where they get closer to each other. And so it's the varying effects of these currents, thanks to geography, that is causing this very different set of circumstances on either side. Now, one of the things you might immediately notice looking at this kind of chart is, well, hang on a minute, there's still a fair bit of that shallow colour off of the English coast, and yes, there is. However, you'll immediately notice that the French coast is, broadly speaking, a lot smoother, again, because it suffered a much more gentle erosion. The English coast is a lot more jagged, and that actually bears out the closer in you zoom on a map. You see that the English coast is actually quite rough, whereas the French Channel coast is in most areas still relatively regular. So where are these areas of alluvial deposits coming off of the English coast if the channel currents should be sweeping them away and eroding away the land that is bringing those deposits to the seabed? Well, part of the material is the coastline as it's being eroded and then dumped onto the seabed and then gradually being extracted away. Some of it is continuing alluvial deposit from the various rivers that come to the southern coast of England, but the vast majority of it, you'll notice, basically occurs in the shadows of the various small peninsulas of the English coast. When you remember that you have a prevailing current coming from west-southwest and heading east-northeast, then suddenly you realize the areas immediately to the left of most of these peninsulas almost immediately go to fairly deep water or have a very limited shallow area, whereas the areas to the right or the east of the peninsulas tend to have these areas of slightly shallower water. So these individual peninsulas are essentially forming shields, like modern breakwaters, to allow the build-up of a graduated seabed. But in almost all cases, the minute that seabed extends out into the main channel flow, it gets cut away. And all this has a huge effect on not only the number of ports, but the kind of ports and the capacity of ports that you can have along the Channel coast, at least without massive intervention by human geoengineering, which does start to happen in the 19th century. More on that later. So what kind of ports do you get? Well, on the English coast, it means that there are multiple areas where some particularly hard portion of the landscape has formed a peninsula and formed one of these somewhat sheltered areas. And then you have usually a river, but occasionally an inclusion of very soft material that's been eroded away to form an inlet without too much in the way of a river, but it's usually rivers. You tend to get a riverine port. So that's a city or a port that has been built up adjacent to a river that also is exiting out into the sea. And that's why so many historic English ports on the south coast are something, usually the name of the river, and then mouth, because it's the mouth of the river. So Plymouth, Falmouth, Exmouth, Portsmouth, Bournemouth, Dartmouth. And even when you're looking at ports that perhaps don't have a mouth appellation, like, say, Shoreham, you'll find that there's still a river there. Weymouth, of course, being another famous one. So you have these rivers plunging out to sea. We have towns becoming ports, building up alongside them. Great, fantastic. So you have a sheltered anchorage where you can build ships and you can anchor ships, but you kind of have the same thing happening on the French coast. Saint-Malo, Harfleur, Le Havre, Le Courtois, Boulogne, and Calais, to name but a few. But it's what happens immediately outside of these ports that then becomes the deciding factor. Because off of most of the English ports, as we've already established, the seabed falls away relatively quickly to deep water, but you also have the shelter of these very hard outcroppings of land that have become peninsulas. And so that means that, yes, you have a port, but you also have a fairly large sheltered anchorage, which in most weathers will allow you to have a fleet of ships anchored just offshore in a relative safety. And this, of course, means that the natural capacity of these ports is quite substantial because it's not restricted by just what ships can you get in the relatively narrow river or potentially river estuary area. It also, for the most part, means that access to and from the deep water, not just for anchoring large ships, but also for transporting large ships out to sea from their places of construction, and then for trade and for war, getting access to the deep water to sail up and down the English Channel, is relatively close and relatively easy. Because the outflowing rivers only have to cut a deeper channel through the alluvial deposits for a short period, and then, hey, you're out in the main part of the channel in terms of depth. So if you look at Plymouth, for example, which is a very old and critical English port and naval base, you have a relatively decent anchorage, formed in part by the shield provided by Ramhead over on the west. But even before you're past the entrance of the harbour as defined by Dresden and Rennie Point, you're already in pretty deep water. So that means, for example, when the Spanish Armada shows up, as the minute you're out of Plymouth Harbour, you're able to manoeuvre relatively freely. Pretty much the only wind that's going to trap you in Plymouth is going to be a wind that's coming from the south-southwest. Whereas if we go almost directly south to Saint-Malo, which would be its approximate equivalent, you can see that internally the sheltered area of Saint-Malo Harbour is pretty shallow except for a single channel that wends its way out, and then once you get past the point defined by Le Moulinet and Ile de Saint-Malo, out into the channel itself, you have an extensive area of very shallow water. So there's still a very narrow channel by which large, deep-hulled ships can actually go. So a fleet of large sailing warships trying to depart from Saint-Malo is going to exit the primary wind shadow of the land and still be in very confined waters as it tries to get out into the main part of the English Channel, and that's very risky. Because obviously if you have a prevailing, let's say, wind coming from the west, it's going to constantly be trying to force you into the shallows and thus aground. So your opportunities to both enter and leave Saint-Malo when you're operating under sail are very much restricted compared to what they would be if you're trying to enter or leave Plymouth. Now, you do get eventually to an area of deeper water, but then, of course, that area of deeper water is exposed and nowhere near as suitable as a major anchorage for large shipping. You'll also notice that the overall sheltered area of Saint-Malo, whether it be deep or shallow, is somewhat smaller than that of Plymouth. And as you go up the English coast, you'll see this pattern repeated with variations for most of the English ports. There'll be a relatively large sheltered area, that is sheltered directly by land, with substantial amounts of deep water allowing access relatively swiftly to deeper waters in the main channel, and those deeper waters are in turn usually in some form of shadow against currents and winds, which means that you can have a fairly substantial fleet lying off of the port if you want, whereas most French ports tend to have relatively small enclosed harbour areas compared to most of the English ports. The water depth in those ports is quite shallow, and then you fight your way past a degree of shallow water, and then once you get out into the deep water, because of the relatively smooth nature of the French coast, that deep water is very open and exposed, and therefore not suitable for long-term anchorage. You see this, for instance, in the time of the Spanish Armada. The Armada goes to anchor off of Calais, and yes, there is water that they can anchor in off of Calais, but they know immediately that it is a very exposed anchorage and not suitable for long-term use. Of course, the fact that fire ships turn up in the immediate aftermath of their anchoring doesn't help matters, but they're never going to stay there very long. So you might think, well, therefore, the English coast should be a hive of maritime activity and the French coast should be a desert. Well, not quite, because we're talking in terms of military tactics, where you need larger, deeper draft ships to be either warships or large transports. If you're doing coastal trade or fishing, this generally requires smaller, shallower draft ships and boats, and in those cases, they can actually thrive in these shallow water environments because, well, one, they're relatively safe from predation by big, heavy warships designed for the open ocean. Two, shallow waters tend to be quite abundant in terms of sea life, especially for things like fishing. And three, obviously, calmer waters make for easier sailing. And so the French Channel coast historically flourished, but it flourished primarily as a commercial area for the local economy, and in some places, like Le Havre, a more international trade hub. Whereas on the English side of things, that kind of shallow water, calm environment was very, very limited, but you had, at least in commercial terms, more opportunities for larger ships to go on large international voyages. And so, navally speaking, as soon as warships become of any substantial size, England has far more places to base warships in the Channel for both its own defence and for attacks on France than France does. So this partially explains the Norman conquest, apart from the fact that the English coast was essentially undefended because Harold's army was all the way up north. The kind of ships used in the Norman period were fairly small and fairly shallow draft, and so a lot of these issues didn't really apply to them. But even by the 1200s, 1300s, when you start to get hulks and cogs and all sorts of other medieval ships, the number of places on the French Channel coast that could base large numbers of large ships was getting very limited. And these currents, ultimately, and the associated geography and geology that results from those, also have a major factor to play in why you see a lot of English incursions into France and not so many French incursions into England unless they're invited and permitted. And that is that the English coast, being somewhat more eroded, becomes very cliff-filled, very rocky, very uneven, and thus there aren't actually that many places that you can land. Now, I do need to do another video completely separately on why landing on the southeast English coast generally is a terrible idea, but that's partly to do with currents and geography at the coastline itself, and also a lot to do with the internal geography of the southeast of England, so that's why it's going to be a separate video. But even along the central and western portions of the English Channel coast, there just aren't that many places you can actually land. Sure, there are beaches everywhere, but if you want to land on most beaches, you're just going to end up facing a massive cliff with no way up. And most of the areas where there aren't just inaccessible massive cliffs have been inhabited already, and therefore there's some degree of defences there, as well as the ability of people to warn other people that hostiles are coming. Now, as I said, that doesn't prevent raids, and during the Cinque Ports period in the early medieval period, even full-on burnings of towns, but these are localized incursions as opposed to full-scale invasions. Conversely, on the French coast, there are many areas where you can land troops. There aren't that many areas where you'd want to anchor a fleet for a long period of time, but it makes defending the northern French coast an incredibly difficult prospect, because yes, of course you will defend your towns, but unlike with the English coast, generally speaking, if an invader wants to land relatively unopposed, they can just land 10, 15 miles up the beach, and they'll have almost as easy a time getting ashore there as they would if they came into your port. So an example of this would be Henry V's campaign that ultimately leads to the Battle of Agincourt. He is initially going for the port of Harfleur. Now, the French actually put a defensive force down, both in Harfleur, and a roving force which looks at the terrain and goes, right, here is the most obvious landing point close to Harfleur for Henry to land, therefore we're going to defend that. This was a good idea. Henry sailed up, saw that there was a French force defending there, and went, oh, I'll just land on the other side of this bay I've found. Because I can, because the geography allows for it. And that's a fairly short trip by ship, but obviously for the French defending force, they'd have to go all the way up the river valley to find a crossing point and come all the way back down, so there was no way they were going to get to the new landing site before Henry's forces were fully landed. And of course, if they tried, Henry could have just waited for them to go a day's march or so up the river looking for a ford or a bridge and gone, okay, I'll just land where I wanted to originally because now you're not defending it anymore. Now, critically, of course, once Henry has landed, his fleet doesn't hang around for very long. Partly that's because it costs money, but also it's just not a suitable coastline to have a fleet hanging around in any large numbers for any particular length of time, so they will go away, which incidentally is part of the reason why you end up with the Battle of Agincourt, because once he's captured Harfleur and then decided actually he's not going to go deep into France, Henry has to march for English-held Calais to find ships to get him back home. Whereas if the French coast had offered somewhat larger harbours that were more naturally conducive to long-term sheltering of large fleets, then he could have had a fleet meet him a lot closer. Of course, none of this prevents small individual pirate ships from doing their business, so there was a roaring trade in French corsairs along the English coast for a good chunk of the hostile period between England and France, but that's rather different to large-scale naval movements. So we've established that thanks to currents, geography, and geology, the English have a huge advantage when it comes to basing fleets of large warships on the English coast, and they have natural geographic advantages in defending it as well. So you might think, okay, well, in the context of the Channel, fine, the English have a much better ability to defend their holdings and attack French holdings, and obviously the inverse is true for the French, but the world isn't confined to just the Channel. And indeed, France does have a series of rather large ports, which, for the vast majority of the time period the Channel covers, are incredibly suitable for basing very large fleets out of, and where you can therefore leverage France's huge population and economical advantage to build a massive invasion force, which you theoretically could then sail into the Channel and take England with. Most proximately to the problem is, of course, the port of Brest on the Brittany Peninsula, but on the southwestern side. And over just past the eastern entrance of the English Channel, there's a rather wonderful set of ports in what we would now call Belgium and the Netherlands, but for the majority of the period that we're looking at would be known initially as the Duchy of Burgundy, which was notionally a part of France for a good length of time, And then later on would become the Spanish Netherlands and various other people in charge until, of course, they became independent and became the Netherlands. So this is where wind and, to a certain extent, politics comes in to ruin France's day yet again. Because if you want to marshal a big invasion fleet in the Age of Sail to go after England, then you're pretty much going to have to muster it in Brest. I mean, you could muster it further south, but then it's just got further to sail, and it's going to face the same issues. So you're either mustering it in Brest, or you are going to stop over there at some point. So you can treat that as kind of the launch point. And yes, of course, you could assemble smaller fleets along the Channel coast, but we've just established why you're not going to have a really big fleet there for the most part. So, fleet in Brest, fantastic. It's right at the western entrance of the Channel. Surely you can just sail up the Channel and, exploit your massive economic advantage to invade England. Well, as we said, the wind is kind of a problem. With Brest being on the southern side of the Brittany Peninsula, it means that you need a wind coming from somewhere in roughly the eastern direction to get out of the port, whether that be a northeasterly polar continental wind or a southeasterly tropical continental wind. So great, now you're out of Brest. Unfortunately now, the wind is taking you out into the Atlantic. So you now need the wind to change direction to become either coming out of the northwest or the southwest. Now, the good news for you is that during the majority of the period the Channel covers, as you can see from these windrows diagrams, the vast majority of winds going up and down the Channel are coming from the west or the east or the southwest or the northeast, so allowing passage basically east to west or west to east along the Channel. Great. Unfortunately for the French, with your port of Brest outside of the English Channel, you need a wind, as we said, from a vaguely easterly direction to get out of your port, and then you need it to switch to something coming out of the west for you to get into the Channel. If you are the English, and for example, you are based in Plymouth, just inside the Channel, and your ship's spies, intelligence, or whatever reports that, hey, there's a large French fleet gathering in Brest and they want to invade you, this is not a quick thing, you are going to know that this is going to happen, then, well, when a suitable wind for getting ships out of Brest blows up, and you're in Plymouth, let's say it's a relatively common easterly or northeasterly wind, well, you just sail out of your port and you block the western end of the Channel. And then either the wind doesn't abate and you kind of just sit there riding the wind as the French get blown out into the Atlantic, or the wind does change and you go, okay, well, now we're going to just ride the wind out coming the other way. And when the French fleet shows up, well, your fleet is now defending the Channel and they have to fight their way through. But you might think, well, okay, so the English have Plymouth and some of the other major bases at their coasts. Why don't we just put a whole bunch of smaller fleets in these smaller ports, as much as each port can sustain on the French coast, and then sail with a southerly wind across the Channel, all in one lot and congregate in one place? Well, apart from the fact that lots of small individual fleets in lots of small individual ports invites the English and later the British to just come over and destroy them in detail, the other problem is, yes, a southerly wind would pin the English forces in place, but you very rarely get a southerly wind in the Channel, and it's not very predictable. The primary winds that go through the Channel, as we saw from the windrows, are almost entirely either from the southwest or the northeast or the east and the west. And when they're coming from anywhere else, they're coming from the southeast, coming kind of from the central Mediterranean up over Italy and the lower part of Germany and then across northeastern France, or they're coming in from the northwest from the vague direction of Iceland. Now, we did mention the Netherlands, dash the Duchy of Burgundy, dash whatever else it was called at various points in time. So you might ask, well, why didn't the French try and control it? They did. But everybody else was very determined that this should not happen. I mean, obviously, the locals had some opinions on not being ruled by other people, which is why you eventually get the Netherlands. But even before that, the Burgundians had pretty good trade links with the English and with other nations. And so during most of the Middle Ages, you have the fairly significant strife between the Armagnacs, who are kind of, if you like, the classic French, and the Burgundians, who really also would like to be in charge and don't like the Armagnacs don't like them, because one's in charge and the other isn't, and obviously the one who isn't in charge thinks it should be the other way around. And let's just say the English were very happy to exacerbate that particular set of tensions, because the area now known as the Netherlands is really England's one true weakness when it comes to the Channel and adjacent areas, because the Scheldt, Antwerp, etc., has a whole load of really nice deep water ports, can shelter loads and loads of ships, and yeah, it's a bit shallow on the approaches in and out, but you can navigate it relatively well, and more importantly, it is aligned with southeasterly winds. So if there is a southeasterly or easterly wind, i.e. a wind coming from the southeast or the east, it's fairly easy to sail out of the Scheldt, and then it's a fairly short hop heading west to hit England. And the big problem that England would have in that case is that if you have, let's say, for sake of argument, a wind coming out of the west, or to be honest, even a wind coming out of the northeast, that will take a fleet that's coming out of the Scheldt straight to England, and at the same time, it will pin English forces in place. The great naval base at Chatham on the Medway and the Nore anchorage, that it means you have to come around Kent to defend the southern coast, but a northeasterly or easterly wind will pin you in place and prevent you from doing that, or you'd have to tack an awful lot, by which point the enemy fleet would have bypassed you. And any ships that are in the Channel would have to exit their bases and again tack very heavily. There's no switch around of winds needed like you would be needing if you were coming out of Brest. And the other big problem that the English face is that, apart from Dover, once you get much east of the kind of Portsmouth, Brighton area, because the Channel is beginning to narrow, you start to get a, relatively speaking, compared to the central and western parts of the English Channel coast, a somewhat smooth, very cliff-like coastline that is, in terms of being able to establish major ports, actually very similar to the issues the French have. It's not quite the same, because you've actually got over-enthusiastic erosion as opposed to over-enthusiastic deposition. But it's notable that although this area, being very close to France, obviously had the original Cinque ports, very active trading ports, by the time you're talking about the classic age of sail, a lot of these ports have silted up, in some cases to the point that those places aren't even ports anymore, they're towns inland. And you might think, hang on, you were talking about erosion. Yes, well, the problem is the erosion changes the paths of the rivers, and that in turn changes the routes of deposition, and also as various bits of land get eroded away, bits that were sheltered now aren't and get scoured, and new bits that were previously scoured might now be sheltered either by fallen or transported rock or just the general change in the overall profile of the coastline. So these smaller ports, one, in some cases don't exist, and two, aren't really capable of supporting major fleets that could defend immediately against a fleet coming out of the Scheldt riding on a wind coming out of the east heading west. And so it's in Britain's interests, and England's interest before Britain, to ensure that that particular area of the northern European coast remains not in the hands of France. They don't particularly care whose hands it's in, as long as it's not the French. So it could be the Burgundians, as long as the Burgundians are on the outs with the Armagnacs and won't support them in any attempts to invade England. And of course, keep good trade relations going with them, because then it makes it somewhat counterintuitive to attack your largest trading partner. And then once they become the Spanish Netherlands, well, that's not great, because the Spanish might try something. Indeed, that is what the Spanish were thinking of doing with the Armada. But the Spanish are less likely to come after you than the French. And then once the Netherlands get their independence, which of course Britain, or England at the time, greatly supports, then, well, now the Dutch are occupying the area that's the best launching point for an invasion of you, but they have enough issues with their land-based enemies and a small enough population in and of themselves that they, in and of themselves, are not an invasion risk to you. And so finally that brings us to Cherbourg, which we did mention a little bit earlier, but this will kind of be the wrap-up point. So why is Cherbourg, or more correctly the Cherbourg Peninsula, part of the problem? Well, As you get further along the coast, if the Cherbourg Peninsula wasn't there, if some hand of deity reached out and deleted it, it's reasonably arguable that the coastal currents along the channel would actually start to lay closer and closer to the French coast, pick up a bit of speed, and thus you might end up in the area east of Caen and perhaps west of Boulogne with a situation that's actually similar to the English Channel coast from, say, Portsmouth going west. But that great Cherbourg Peninsula means that, well, there's another massive land shadow going on, and that enhances and exacerbates the issues of the very gentle, sloping, heavy deposition French coast. And what about Cherbourg itself, you might ask? I mean, it's a major port today. Why didn't the French develop that a lot sooner? Well, the big problem with Cherbourg is that it requires that macro-scale human engineering we talked about earlier. It's stuck out right on the end of, shockingly enough, the Cherbourg Peninsula, but as a result, although it does stick out into the channel currents quite a bit, and thus the overall terrain of the Cherbourg Peninsula in terms of coastline much more closely resembles the coastline of England on the opposite side of the channel in that area. Across the top of it, where the town of Cherbourg is found these days, it gets swept quite heavily by the current. So you've got, okay, fair enough, fairly close access to deep water, and Cape de la Hague, or Cape de la Hague, on the western end does provide some shelter against wind and waves. So you've got a degree of offshore deep water safe anchorage. Not massive, but still a lot better than a lot of other French ports along the Channel coast have. But the problem is that La Divette, the little river that runs into the sea at Cherbourg, is not exactly the world's largest or most inspiring river. It's just big enough to transport silt down to the area, not big enough to actually carve much of a channel out into the deep water, even if the deep water is relatively close off the coast. And so, although Cherbourg has, as a town, a relatively long history, but as a major port, a not particularly long one, because it was a very heavily silted up place, and so only smaller craft could go to and from the historic Cherbourg, even with that tempting deep water just offshore. There just wasn't a channel into it, Cherbourg. But once you get to the 19th century, France recognizes, among other things, the tactical value of a channel port, basically slap bang in the middle of the channel, and they build a massive set of breakwaters. They do a whole ton of dredging, and suddenly Cherbourg is a major naval base, and the fact that it's almost right opposite Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight, and thanks to the peninsula, somewhat closer than the average French coastline, is not lost on anybody, least of all the British. It should come as no surprise to anyone that at that point, suddenly, Portsmouth, which has been a fairly important major naval base in British history up to that point, suddenly becomes a heck of a lot more important. But at the same time, this also coincides with the rise of the steamship. So a lot of the wind issues start to go away because in the late 19th century and onwards, steam power means that you can now just sail straight across the channel almost regardless of what the wind is doing. And that leads to a whole load of invasion scares, Penny Dreadful invasion scare books, and a bunch of fortification along the southern coast. So Cherbourg is a rather intriguing paradox for the French because in and of itself, it is probably the single best thing you could hope for if you want to build a major navy on the French Channel coast to invade England. Unfortunately, you can only develop it as a port towards the end of the 19th century when other technological and political changes mean that it's extremely unlikely you're ever actually going to. And on top of that, its existence as a peninsula is a good chunk of what actually prevents you having a more traditional, decent port anywhere else along the French Channel coast from which you could stage a major invasion of England. And that, I think, will wrap us up for now. This is obviously a very high-level overview because we're discussing matters of hydrographics, geology, geography, tactics, atmospherics, all sorts of things. And I know from previous experience and correspondence that some of you guys who watch this channel are actually experts in both geology and particularly hydrography, that is obviously geology and geography as related to the sea, and some even specifically with regards to the English Channel. So if you want to chime in with more detailed explanations and so forth, then please feel free to do so in the comments. I'd really look forward to that. And other than that, thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this 40-minute or so discussion on why the very Earth itself seems to hate France and prevent it from ever invading England successfully, unless you happen to be the Normans. Bye for now.